43 centimetres. A strip of metal about the length of your arm, from elbow to fingertips, lying on a runway outside Paris. In 90 seconds, it will destroy this aircraft. But it is not the reason Concorde died. This is £170 million. That was the top of the estimate in 1962 to build it. By 1974, the bill stood at £1,070 million, and the minister responsible stood up in Parliament and said none of it would ever be recovered. Then, in 1984, the government sold its stake in Concorde's earnings for £16.5 million and threw in 2 of the aircraft at £1 each. That is not a scandal, and it is not a mistake. It is the most honest number in this story. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why it made perfect sense, and why the same arithmetic means nobody has flown faster than sound on a scheduled airline since. To be worth £1, a thing has to be worth nothing to everyone else. So start there. Who else wanted a Concorde? And the astonishing answer is that for a few years, almost everybody did. 16 airlines held options on 74 aircraft. Pan Am, TWA, Japan Airlines, Qantas. On paper, the future was supersonic. All 16 walked away. Every single one. And the reason is the first thing that makes the pound make sense. They did the arithmetic, and the aircraft could not be flown where the money was. Because a supersonic aircraft does not go bang once when it breaks the sound barrier. It drags the bang behind it, continuously, along its whole track over the ground, like the wake behind a boat. Everyone underneath hears it, which meant every country it crossed could simply ban it, and they did. So the fastest airliner ever built was allowed over water, and almost nothing else. Britain and France would spend years fighting New York for the one route where the numbers worked, and would not win it until 1977. But the order book did not wait for them. In 1973, the price of oil quadrupled. 3 blows, and the order book was empty. Britain and France had spent more than £1,000 million to build an aircraft that only Britain and France would ever fly. The raw numbers make that look like a 6-fold overrun. It is not. Prices had roughly doubled in between, so in real money they overspent by about 3 times. Every figure in this video is in the money of its own day, and that one is north of £10 billion in today's. And they could not stop. Because what Britain and France signed in 1962 was not a contract. It was a treaty, binding at the level of nations, and it was written so that neither country could withdraw without the other's agreement. 2 governments watching a bill climb past £1,000 million, legally unable to walk away from each other. That is the machinery behind the pound. Not incompetence, commitment, of a kind only a state can make. A company facing that overrun stops. A treaty does not let you stop. So they finished it, and then they owned it. And then they had to find someone who wanted it. 20 were built. 14 ever carried a paying passenger. 7 British, 7 French. Apart from a Soviet machine that flew passengers for 7 months, that is the entire supersonic airline fleet of planet Earth for 27 years. And by the early 1980s, the British government was still carrying its half of the bill and had no idea what to do with it. Here is the thing about an asset nobody wants. On the government's books, those aircraft were not a triumph of engineering. They were a running loss, with wings. Already paid for, still flying, still costing money every year, and impossible to sell at anything resembling what they had cost. So in 1984, the government stopped trying. British Airways paid £16.5 million for the state's entire stock of Concorde spares and took the last 2 aircraft off its hands at a book value of £1 each. But the spares were not the prize. The prize was written into the same agreement. Until that day, the government took 80% of every pound Concorde earned above its costs. British Airways bought its way out of that clause. From that moment, whatever those aircraft made, the airline kept. And what happened next is the part of this story that should be taught in business schools, and mostly is not. And then British Airways did something clever. They commissioned research into what their own passengers thought a Concorde ticket cost? The answer came back. The passengers thought it cost considerably more than it actually did. They were not buying transport. They were buying the most expensive seat in the sky, and they had never checked the price. So British Airways raised the fare, not by a little, to more than double the first-class fare on an ordinary subsonic aircraft. By the late 1990s, a one-way Atlantic crossing was somewhere around $6,000, and demand did not fall. Read that again, because it is the whole video. The aircraft did not start covering its costs when it flew better, or burned less, or carried more. It started covering them when its owner stopped pretending it was transport and started selling it as jewellery. Over the life of the programme, British Airways is reckoned to have taken around £1.75 billion in revenue against roughly £1 billion in operating cost. Treat those as estimates. The airline never published the line. But by any measure, an airline would recognise Concorde worked. But look at what is missing from that calculation. The design, the prototypes, the wind tunnels, the 14 years of engineering. More than £1,000 million of capital is simply not in the accounts because it was never British Airways to carry. It had already been paid by people who would never board. Which brings us back to the runway. On the 25th of July 2000, a Continental DC-10 took off from Charles de Gaulle. As it rolled, a strip of metal came off it and fell onto the concrete. It was a wear strip, a part designed to protect an engine cowling. It was 435 millimeters long, about 3 centimetres wide, and 1.4 millimeters thick, and it was made of the wrong material. The manufacturer's instructions specified stainless steel. This one had been repaired in a titanium alloy, harder, stiffer, and left lying edge up on a runway. Minutes later, Air France Flight 4590 began its takeoff roll along the same concrete. A tyre struck the strip and burst. A piece of that tyre, thrown upward at enormous speed, ruptured a fuel tank. 109 people were aboard. 4 more were on the ground. None of them survived. Concorde flew again after that. On the 16th of August 2000, both regulators withdrew its certificate of airworthiness, and the fleet sat on the ground for 15 months. It was modified, recertified, and back in service by November 2001. The accident did not end it. It flew for 2 more years, and then both airlines retired it within months of each other in 2003. The reasons given were falling passenger numbers and the cost of maintaining 12 aging aircraft that no one had built spare parts for in a quarter of a century. Which is a polite way of saying that the arithmetic had finally arrived. Because a strip of metal cannot end an era. It can only end an aircraft. What ended the era was that when the 2 airlines looked at replacing Concorde, there was nothing to replace it with. And no one, anywhere in the world, was willing to spend £1,000 million finding out what the successor would cost. Here is what the elegy version never says. Concorde is not a story about a machine too advanced for its time. It is a story about who is allowed to take a risk that large. Only a state could absorb £1,000 million with no way of getting it back, and in 1984 the buyer was not private. British Airways was owned by that same state. It sold the asset to itself, then privatised the profit 3 years later. That is not a scandal, it is the arrangement. Almost every technology you use daily sat, at some point, on a balance sheet that could survive losing everything. A government's, a monopoly's, a founder's fortune. The public pays for the part that cannot be justified. The private sector buys the part that can. The question the money lens asks is simply, who ends up on each side of that line? For Concorde, the answer is unusually clean. The people who paid for it were taxpayers in Britain and France. The people who flew it were, overwhelmingly, not them. So, when you see that aircraft in a museum, and every surviving one is in a museum now, you are not looking at a failure. You are looking at something rarer, a machine that worked perfectly, made money, and still could not be allowed to exist. Because sometimes the biggest picture in history hides inside the smallest detail. Even 43 centimetres of the wrong metal lying on a runway.